Working as a gravedigger was never something I planned for my life. It was a job that simply fell into my lap when I needed quick and stable money. Over time, I got used to the routine, the silence of the cemetery, the quiet nights. I even learned to appreciate the peace it offered. For many, the cemetery is a place of sadness or fear, but for me, it was always just work, at least until recently. In the past few months, something changed. The silence that was once comforting started being disturbed by sounds I couldn't understand. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the wind passing through the trees or nocturnal animals rustling the ground. It was a low sound, almost imperceptible but constant, like a distant murmur. The kind of sound you only notice when everything around you is absolutely quiet. At first, I tried to ignore it. After all, it wasn't the first time the cemetery had played tricks on me. When you spend so much time alone in a place like this, your mind can play tricks on you. But the sounds started to repeat, always in the same spot, near one of the freshly dug graves. Every night, as I passed that area, the whispers seemed stronger, clearer, as if something was trying to rise from there. It was hard to believe what I was hearing. I wasn't superstitious. I'd always been skeptical of the ghost stories that surround cemeteries. But it was undeniable that something different was happening. The whispers followed me, staying at a distance, as if they were waiting for the right moment to reveal something. By the third night of hearing the whispers, I began to feel uneasy. Every time I approached the grave, the sound intensified, sending chills down my spine. What was going on there? Was it just the wind moving the earth? Or was there something beneath it? I still didn't know, but I was determined to find out. After restless nights with the whispers echoing in my mind, I decided I needed answers. I couldn't keep ignoring it. What was happening there? Was it something natural, or was I losing my mind? That's when, on a particularly quiet night, I decided to talk to the cemetery watchman. The watchman was an older man, a man of few words, with more time in the cemetery than I had. He usually did night rounds, ensuring everything was in order. If anyone had noticed something strange, it would be him. "Have you heard anything strange around here?" I asked, trying to sound casual as he locked the cemetery gate. "I mean, sounds like whispers." He paused for a moment, his tired eyes analyzing me before responding. The silence between us seemed to grow. "Whispers, huh?" he said, lowering his voice. "Yeah, I've heard them. More times than I'd like." I was surprised by his direct response. The way he said it, so casually, made me feel like there was much more going on than I had imagined. He continued, adjusting his coat as if uncomfortable with the subject. "You're not the first gravedigger to hear those sounds, you know." He looked at me over his shoulder, his eyes carrying the weight of old experiences. Many have heard them, and most of them didn't stick around after that. I didn't know if he was trying to scare me, but my hands started to sweat. He spoke as if it were common, but there was something in his expression that made me suspicious. "What do you think it is?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my voice trembled slightly. The watchman shrugged. "It's not the kind of thing you want to find out. My advice: leave it alone. There are things best left undisturbed." His words left me even more uneasy. How could I just leave something like that alone without investigating? There was something beneath those graves, something I needed to know. But at the same time, the watchman's warning kept echoing in my head. Even with the warning, I decided I couldn't just let it go. I had to find out what was happening. The watchman's words kept hammering in my mind all night. There are things best left undisturbed. But how could I just ignore it? I'm not the kind of person who gets scared easily, and the idea of continuing to hear those whispers without doing anything was tormenting me. That same night, I decided I would investigate on my own. I waited for the watchman to finish his round and leave, and then, armed only with my phone's flashlight and a shovel, I went back to the spot where the whispers seemed the strongest. The grave in question was in a more secluded area, surrounded by old trees that blocked the moonlight. Everything around was steeped in darkness. The The cemetery, which seemed peaceful during the day, took on an oppressive presence at night. With each step I took toward the grave, the whispers seemed to grow louder. The sound, though low, became clearer, like several voices murmuring at the same time. When I finally arrived, I stopped in front of the headstone. The engraved letters were worn by time, making it hard to make out the name. The burial date was old, much older than I expected. I took out my flashlight and illuminated the ground around the grave. Something felt off. The soil looked disturbed, but there were no recent records of exhumations there. I had checked the cemetery's papers earlier, and officially, no one had been buried there in decades. A chill ran down my spine. With trembling hands, I plunged the shovel into the ground. Each movement seemed to amplify the whispers, as if the voices were watching me, encouraging me to continue. What was I hoping to find? Part of me didn't know, but another part couldn't stop. I had to see for myself. As I dug, the whispers began to change into something else, almost like words, but incomprehensible. With each shovelful of dirt I removed, the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger. Finally, after digging for a while, the blade of the shovel hit something hard. It was the coffin. I froze. My breath caught in my chest as I felt the shovel hit the coffin. The hollow sound reverberated through the night, while the whispers around me seemed to grow stronger, as if they were eager for what I was about to discover. My heart pounded so hard that I could almost hear it over the soft wind rustling through the trees. I hesitated for a moment. The watchman's words came back to my mind. There are things best left undisturbed, but it was too late. I had already come too far. I set the shovel aside and, with trembling hands, began to clear away the remaining dirt with my hands. The coffin's lid was old, weathered by time. It shouldn't have been there, not according to the cemetery records, but there it was, buried beneath the earth, like a forgotten secret. I took a deep breath and prepared to open the lid. When I finally lifted it, a strong stench of decay and dampness hit me hard. The air was thick, almost tangible. Inside the coffin, what I saw made me step back, nearly dropping my flashlight. It wasn't a normal body. What was lying there looked more like a thing than a person. The skin was dark, shriveled, as if it had been consumed by the earth long ago. But what truly terrified me was that, even in that condition, the body seemed alive. Not exactly breathing, but the whispers I had been hearing were clearly emanating from that coffin. The skeletal hands, still at first glance, began to move, almost imperceptibly. There were no eyes on the creature's face, only empty sockets. But I knew I was being watched. That ancient being, trapped for who knows how long, was staring at me somehow, and the sound coming from its mouth, a continuous whisper, was now louder, almost like a muffled scream. I screamed in fear, stumbling backward. I let go of the coffin lid, which fell with a thud that echoed throughout the cemetery. Despair took over, and in pure panic, I ran. I ran without looking back, as the whispers seemed to follow, chasing me. I reached the watchman's house, panting, my heart racing, and my thoughts in complete chaos. My hands were trembling so much I could barely grip the doorknob. I knocked frantically until the old watchman, surprised by my presence at that hour, opened the door. "What happened to you?" he asked, his expression tense. I entered without asking for permission, the words tumbling out of my mouth. The coffin. The coffin was open. "There's something there, something that shouldn't be there," I said, breathless, pointing outside. "It's not human, it's ancient, and it's alive. Somehow." The watchman looked at me with eyes that, at that moment, seemed far too old, as if he already knew exactly what I was talking about. He offered me a chair, and I sat down, feeling the weight of what I had just experienced crashing down on me like an avalanche. "I warned you not to dig any deeper," he murmured, as if the explanation was simple, almost inevitable. "This cemetery has more stories than you can imagine. You're not the first to see whatever it is that's in that grave." "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's buried there?" The watchman sighed deeply and looked out the window toward the cemetery. where only the moonlight illuminated the headstones. He didn't give me a direct answer. He just shook his head. There are things that don't belong to this world. Ancient things, forgotten, and trapped. They try to reach us through the whispers. I've heard them myself, many others have too, but no one can free them. But no, not completely. His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My fear turned into a dark certainty. I had disturbed something I shouldn't have. Even after I left the cemetery that night, the whispers continued to haunt me. Sometimes I hear them in my dreams. Sometimes, even during the day, the watchman was right. There are things that should be left alone, but now the whispers will never leave me. I've been a gravedigger for as long as I can remember. It's not a glamorous job, but it suits me. The solitude, the quiet, it's peaceful in its own way. Most nights, it's just me and my thoughts, with the occasional help from my friend Tom, who works with me when the jobs get bigger. We've seen our fair share of strange things over the years, but nothing like what happened that night. It started with a routine call. A coffin had been found in an old, forgotten part of the cemetery, and we were tasked with reburying it. The sky was dark and stormy, with rain coming down in heavy sheets, making everything more difficult. When we got to the site, the first thing I noticed was how old the coffin looked, rusted chains wrapped around it like a warning. "Why is it locked like that?" Tom asked, his voice uneasy. I shrugged. "Maybe it's to keep something in," I joked, though the sight of it unsettled me too. We lowered it into the ground, the rain soaking us as we worked. That's when we first heard it. A faint knocking, coming from inside the coffin. At first, I thought it was just the sound of shifting wood, but Tom's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my gut tightening as the sound grew louder, more insistent. The knocking was rhythmic, deliberate, not like something settling or moving naturally. It was like a message, a signal. We both stood there, staring at the coffin, the rain hitting the ground in rapid, heavy thuds, but neither of us could hear anything but the knocking. "That's not possible," I said, trying to reason with myself, but the look in Tom's eyes told me he wasn't buying it. "It's coming from inside," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly would make it worse. His grip on the shovel tightened. "We need to open it." "No," I said firmly. "We finish the job and leave. It's probably just air or something. There's no way—" My voice trailed off, but even I didn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. The knocks continued, louder now. Each one seemed to vibrate through the air, echoing off the gravestones. Tom looked at me, desperation in his eyes. "We can't just ignore it," but that's exactly what I intended to do. We were here to bury the coffin, not open it. Whatever was inside was meant to stay there. With every ounce of logic I had, I convinced myself to keep digging, even as the fear began to gnaw at me. The knocking continued, growing louder with each passing second, until it felt like the very air around us was trembling. Tom was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he gripped the shovel. I could see the panic growing in his eyes, and I wasn't far behind. The logical part of my brain kept trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing about this was normal. Coffins don't knock. Dead people don't knock. "We can't just leave it like this," Tom muttered. His voice was barely audible over the sound of the rain and the relentless banging from within the coffin. "I told you. We finished the job," I snapped, more out of fear than anger. I didn't want to think about what might happen if we opened it. I didn't want to know what was inside. But as the sound intensified, it became harder to ignore the creeping doubt in the back of my mind. What if something or someone was trapped inside? The thought gnawed at me, even as I forced myself to keep digging. The dirt was wet and heavy, clinging to the shovel with each scoop, but I kept going, praying the knocking would stop. It didn't. Tom finally dropped his shovel, stepping away from the grave, shaking his head. "I'm not doing this. This isn't right." I paused, staring at him, feeling the weight of the situation bear down on both of us. We were in over our heads, and we both knew it. The rain pounded down harder, as if the heavens themselves were warning us to stop. I wanted to listen, to drop everything and run, but something inside me, whether it was pride or sheer stubbornness, kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't just leave. We had to finish this. "Tom, help me," I said, my voice strained. "Let's just get this done." But Tom wouldn't budge. His eyes were fixed on the coffin, his face pale and filled with terror. I could feel the fear clawing at me too, but I wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. I shoveled faster, desperate to bury the thing and end this nightmare. But as I piled the wet earth onto the coffin, the knocking only grew louder, more frantic. It was as if whatever was inside knew we were trying to seal it away, and it was fighting to escape. Each thud sent shivers down my spine. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest, but I kept going. Tom stood frozen, watching me with wide eyes, his breathing shallow and quick. "I'm telling you, something's in there," he whispered, backing away further. "We can't just bury it." I ignored him, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. But deep down, I knew he was right. The knocking, the oppressive atmosphere. It was all wrong, but stopping now felt even worse, like we were teetering on the edge of something dark, something we could never come back from. I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of the fear, the sound of the knocking that now seemed to pulse through the very ground beneath my feet. It was too much. I threw down my shovel, the metal clattering against the wet stone, and turned to Tom. "Let's go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, my body shaking from a mixture of exhaustion and terror. "We're done here." Tom didn't hesitate. He was already backing away, his eyes wide and his face pale. The rain had soaked us to the bone, but the cold I felt wasn't from the weather. It was the chill of something unnatural, something wrong. As we ran towards the cemetery gate, the knocking continued, now distant but still there, like a ghost chasing after us. It was only when we reached the rusted iron gates that the sound finally stopped, leaving behind a deafening silence that felt almost worse. We stood there for a moment, catching our breath, both of us too afraid to look back. "What was that?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. He looked at me like I had the answers, but I didn't. I was just as lost, just as terrified. "I don't know," I muttered, running a hand through my wet hair, "but we're never coming back here." As we walked away from the cemetery, the silence settled over us like a heavy blanket. But deep down, I knew whatever we had disturbed, it wasn't finished with us yet. I've never been the type to believe in ghost stories. Growing up, my family would always sit around the campfire and share tales of haunted houses and cursed objects, but I always chalked it up to old folklore meant to scare kids. As an adult, working as a cemetery caretaker, I became even more skeptical. Cemeteries, in my experience, were just places of quiet and peace, until that night. Our cemetery had its own local legend, one that circulated among the workers and a few town locals. It was about a gravedigger who disappeared without a trace decades ago. All they found was his rusty shovel by an open grave. No one knew what happened to him, and over the years, the story grew into something darker. Whispers about his ghost still wandering the grounds, shovel in hand, waiting for the next unlucky soul. My friend Tom and I had heard the story 100 times, but we never paid it much attention. That was until the night we found the shovel. It was rusted, old, and sticking out of a fresh, open grave that definitely hadn't been there the day before. From the moment we saw it, we knew something wasn't right. The moment we laid eyes on the shovel, an eerie silence settled over the cemetery. It was the kind of silence that makes you painfully aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. Tom and I exchanged glances, both of us sensing the same thing. This wasn't normal, and the air seemed to get heavier, almost pressing down on us, like we had just disturbed something that didn't want to be found. "I don't remember this grave being open," Tom muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't either. We'd been through here just the day before, and there hadn't been any sign of fresh digging. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer to the grave, peering down into the dark hole. The shovel leaned against the edge, rusted but eerily intact, as though it had been waiting there for years. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I had the sudden urge to turn around and leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It felt like we were being watched. "Did you hear that?" Tom's voice broke through my thoughts. He was standing rigid, his eyes darting toward the gravestones behind us. I strained to listen, and that's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere just beyond the graves. We turned, searching for the source, but all we saw were the shadows cast by the flickering cemetery lights. My heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Chapter 3. The Figure in the Shadows, 250 words. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving an oppressive silence hanging in the air. Tom and I stood frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. My heart was racing, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But instead, we stayed, staring into the darkness between the gravestones, searching for the source of the sound. "Let's go," Tom whispered. But before we could move, the cemetery lights flickered. The brief moments of darkness felt like hours. When the lights came back on, I saw it. Standing at the far end of the cemetery, partially hidden among the headstones, was a figure. It was hunched over, its silhouette almost blending into the shadows, but there was no mistaking it. The figure was holding a shovel, the same rusted, decayed tool we had just seen by the open grave. My blood ran cold. "There!" I gasped, pointing. Tom followed my gaze, his face draining of color when he saw it too. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it was judging us, waiting for us to make a move. "Is that him?" Tom whispered, his voice trembling. Neither of us needed to say it aloud. We both knew who it was, the gravedigger, the one who had vanished all those years ago, the one whose story was supposed to be just a legend. But there he was, standing right in front of us. For a few seconds, neither Tom nor I could move. We were paralyzed, gripped by the terrifying reality of what we were seeing. The figure didn't budge. It stood there as if it had all the time in the world watching us. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck, and my mouth went dry. My rational mind screamed that this couldn't be real, but every part of me knew it was. We weren't alone. "We have to go," I finally whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Tom nodded silently, his eyes still fixed on the figure. But neither of us could bring ourselves to turn our backs on it. The lights flickered again, plunging us into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, the figure had moved closer, just a few steps, but it was enough. That was all we needed to snap out of our trance. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Tom's arm and pulling him with me. We bolted down the path, weaving through the gravestones as fast as our legs would carry us. I could hear Tom's panicked breaths beside me, and I didn't dare look back. The footsteps were back, but this time they were running too, fast, purposeful, closing in on us. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed through the pain. We had to get out. The gate was just ahead. And for the first time that night, I let myself believe we might actually escape. We stumbled through the cemetery gates, gasping for air, and collapsed onto the gravel path outside. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my heart still racing from the fear that had gripped me. Tom sat beside me, equally shaken, his face pale and drenched in sweat. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, too stunned to process what had just happened. I glanced back toward the cemetery, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching us from the shadows. But the gates were closed now, and the only thing beyond them was darkness and silence. The footsteps had stopped. We were safe. For now. "What the hell was that?" Tom finally whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to answer. How could I? How do you explain something like that? The gravedigger was supposed to be a myth, a story to keep people entertained during late-night shifts. But tonight, we had seen him. We had felt his presence, heard his footsteps, and we had run for our lives. "We can't go back there," I said, my voice hoarse. "Not at night. Not after this." Tom nodded in agreement. There was no way we'd ever return to the cemetery during the night shift again. The legend of the gravedigger wasn't just a story anymore. It was real, and it had come far too close for comfort. From that night on, the cemetery would never feel the same again, and neither would we. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.